With the new Arcane Journal, Wood Elves have some wild magic options, and I think they're worth talking about, breaking down how I'm interested in playing around with them, and why I think Sisters of the Thorn actually make a comeback with this book. I'm still very early in testing what I like about Wood Elves compared to the things that look fun but maybe don't actually make the cut. And I'd say there are two levels of things that I'm going to talk about today. There's the stuff that I think is interesting and genuinely probably quite good, and then there's the stuff that's interesting and I like it and I want it to work, but maybe it doesn't. So we're gonna talk about the two different ones in here, and I think you're going to be able to tell which is which. Spoiler: anything to do with making tree whack better, maybe not good, but definitely interesting. So I'm going to play around with it. First things first, let's go through the new Lore of the Wild. I have already talked about this in yesterday's video where myself and Nicholas from Team France did do a full breakdown of the Arcane Journal. If you want to hear more about it, go and check there. But this is more an individual breakdown on how I think the magic is going to play, and I'm going to look at some builds as well that we can potentially put together for Wood Elves now that we've got the Arcane Journal. Starting off, we've got the new Lore of the Wild, and it does come with an interesting signature spell. It's not one that I'm super in love with, because it's a range self spell. So, it's an enchantment, you cast it on an 8, and until your next start of turn subphase, enemy models that shoot at you, and it's only ballistic skill shooting, keeping it in mind, or any unit they have joined, this is the caster, may reroll any rolls to hit of a natural 6. This is pretty solid. It's not bad, but the problem is, you're not running Death Stars typically. I have seen people start to talk about big bricks of 40 Glade Guard that teleport around. I'm on the fence about that. I don't think it's been good before the Arcane Journal. I'm still not convinced that it is good now. However, you know, multiple people talking about it may be worth digging into a little bit to see if it works now. With that in mind, you're probably running units of no more than 8 skirmishing models. So if you're thinking about trying to get value out of this, you're putting in, realistically, because we don't see a lot of level 2 wizards, you're probably going to be seeing a level 4, so you're probably adding 200 to 250 points worth of model to a unit of 8 skirmishers to make it harder for your opponent to shoot you with ballistic skill shooting. It doesn't affect magic missiles, so that's, you know, already a real negative, and it doesn't affect anything like cannons or grudge throwers. You know, there's a lot of stuff that this kind of just gets skipped by, which is why I'm not super in love with it, whereas the Mark of Nurgle in combat, almost everything matters against it, except for stomp attacks and impact hits. So Swirling Mist, a little bit of a miss in my opinion, but that's okay because the rest of the lore is pretty great. First of all, obviously we've got the new magic missile, Fury of Athel Loren. This is a magic missile that casts on 10, which is high for magic missile, 18-inch range, and it's D3 plus 1, strength 6 hits at AP2, multiple wounds 2. I, on my first pass, thought this was the standout spell. I still like it, but I think it's maybe not the first spell you pick. Assuming you go lore familiar with this lore, which I think I'd probably recommend because it's really good, you might end up picking this as sort of your third or fourth spell, depending on what the goal for the caster is. That's to say, if you want to go for a blaster caster, you know, you've still got battle magic available. You can still go for a caster with a Ruby Ring of Rune, a Pillar of Fire, and a Fireball, running around on just an Elven Steed attached to some Glade Riders with reserve move. That's still really good, and it's probably something that still makes it into a lot of my lists. However, this magic missile is in a lore that isn't necessarily all about ranged output, so it's nice to have, and I'm probably not upset to have it, but if I'm thinking about how the caster that's running the Lore of the Wilds is going to play, they might only cast it 3 times in a game, which, that's probably okay. It's still a good spell. The threat of it will make my opponent play differently as well. And that's something that maybe I should talk about in an upcoming video, about whether the rules and abilities you have are important because you use them, or because the effect that they can have on the game and your opponent has to respect that ability. Moving on, we've got Ariel's Blessing, or Ariel's Blessing. It's an enchantment, casting range 9. It's a range 10 spell, which gives the target friendly unit regen 5+. This is good. This is really good. I'm on the fence. I almost would rather have this as a range self spell. The downside to having it be range, 10-inch range, is that yes, you can cast it on units that you're not attached to. That is very good. That opens it up to multiple different ways of playing. But you can't cast it if you're locked in combat. Now, to be fair, elves, especially wood elves, are really squishy. So maybe you're not expecting to end up in long, drawn-out combats, which would make sense with the sort of hit-and-run play style that this book really does lend itself to. But it's a really solid spell. This is one of the first spells that I'm going to be picking up. This is number 1 or number 2 on my list, because if you're playing with, potentially a unit of Wild Riders who are incredibly squishy, giving them the regen, the combat res that, they give up for taking wounds but passing on the regen kind of doesn't matter when they've got as much nuts output as they already do. Third up, we've got Spiteful Torrent, and this is a magical vortex. It's a pretty decent magic vortex if we take out Pillar of Fire, which is, obviously everything damage-wise compared to Pillar of Fire is really underwhelming, but this one's pretty solid. And if you're playing aggressively, I think something like this is really solid. So it's a magic vortex that casts on a 10, 15-inch range, which is good for a vortex. It's a remains in play 3-inch blast template that you place so the central hole is within 15 inches of the caster. So keep in mind that puts the closest edge to your opponent 16.5 inches away from the caster. So you've got a pretty decent range there. It's dangerous terrain, so I really like templates that are terrain, because even if they don't get into combat, if they don't do any damage, even if they don't hit your opponent, you can still use them to make it charges harder. One of the strongest things you can do against Bretonnians, for example, is put some dangerous terrain directly between you and your opponent, so that when those Pegasus Knights go for the charge, they have to take the lowest of the 2 dice. They lose an inch of movement on the fly there. It can make a big difference in their ability to actually get into combat with you, which is always appreciated, those pesky Peg Knights. It does move d6 in a random direction, which means that it can roll a hit and stay still, or it can go completely in the wrong direction. However, like Summon Elemental Spirits, it only hits enemy units, and it does 3d6 strength 2 hits at AP1. This is an elf killer. This is a human killer. This doesn't really matter if you're talking sort of Warriors of Chaos, although it is a high volume of hits. As soon as you're rolling 6s with this, you start to go, I don't love this at all. And you can't take Dark Magic with this, with Wood Elves. If you could take Dark Magic to Word of Pain them and then try and line it up so they get hit by loads of strength 2 hits, but with -1 toughness, that would be cool. But yeah, this is not my first pick. It's not a direct damage spell in the way that Pillar of Fire is, but it's a nice zoning tool. And I quite like zoning tools when you're playing something like Wood Elves, where a lot of the time you're going to be trying to not get caught by your opponent's hammers because you are made out of just a bundle of sticks. You are really, really squishy. Fourth on the docket, we've got the spell that people are most excited to build around, I think, which is Durthu's Wrath. This is an assailment that casts on a 10. That is pretty high, but there are ways to get around it. There's the new item, magic item that gives you +2 to cast, single use. This isn't an extremely common item, so you're probably not going to see it used in combination here. You can go Power Scrolls, or you could go with, there's various extremely common items that may be, not extremely common, there's various core rulebook items that might make it easier to do, and there's the new orb that gives you rerolls of casting spells as well. I think realistically I'm probably just going to be taking Lore Familiar or Oaken Stave and then some Power Scrolls, but it's nice to have options in terms of how you want to build it. The way that it works, every model in the fighting rank of a unit that the caster is engaged with must immediately take an initiative test. Each model that fails this test suffers D3 strength 4 hits with no armor save permitted. Ward and regen saves can be attempted as normal. I'm fairly certain this doesn't spill over, so you have to roll these separately, but if I'm wrong about that, please do correct me, because that would make the spell a lot better and a lot more interesting, plus faster to play. So maybe I've just misunderstood that, which would be cool. This is interesting. So obviously against dwarves, against undead, this is really nice. Against anyone that is going wide, this is really nice. If you're a hater of Linehammer, this is the way that you can bring, justice to those people who dare to run units of 10 wide models. There's a lot of stuff this is really good against. Where this falls down is stuff like elves. So if you're going into elves and everyone has initiative 4 or 5, it's not great. It's not going to do a lot. But there are some ways around it. And again, that's where the Sisters of the Thorn come in. But we'll talk about that as we move into the combos section of this video. Fifth up, Hidden Pathways. I think this is an interesting spell. I was kind of low on it to start off with. Then I went a bit higher on it, and now I'm back to sort of, it's a middling spell. It's probably the 4th spell that I pick up if I'm looking at playing a melee unit. Having reserve move is really nice if you're trying to do shenanigans. Again, if you're bunkering a melee caster, the Durthu's Wrath caster in a unit of Sisters of the Thorn giving them reserve move is quite nice, although they can march and shoot, so it just depends how you want to play around with it. And it's a conveyance spell that's cast on an 8. Again, you can cast it onto a unit that you're not inside, 12-inch range, and until the next start of turn subphase, the friendly unit gets reserve move and can quick turn, which is the pivot you make after making a move, even if it would not normally be able to do so. So that's some nice flexibility, and it's the sort of thing that if you've got a unit that doesn't already have reserve move and might want to bunker a caster, you're quite happy to have. So really, this is if you're looking to take a unit assisted with the Thorn, I think. Finally, we've got Sapping Blight. This is a hex with a 12-inch range, which is pretty low, and it's a casting value of 9. But until your next start of turn subphase, which is always good for hexes, anything that affects your opponent on their turn is a lot stronger than just your turn, target enemy unit suffers a minus D3 modifier to its strength characteristic to a minimum of 1. This spell may target an enemy unit engaged in combat. Suddenly, that 12-inch range becomes a little bit less of a downside. If it's cast, any other hexes on that unit immediately expire. That's fine. Basically, all you do is you cast this first. That's right. You cast this first, and then you cast any of the hexes. This does actually cause an issue if you want to cast the Elementalism debuff, the signature spell that gives you -1 to your opponent's initiative, because that also says any of the hexes immediately end. So you can't combo it there, but having a defensive ability where suddenly, you're charging into a unit, not a dragon, but you're charging into a mid-strength unit that's maybe strength 4, strength 5, and getting them down to potentially strength 2 or, strength 1, and then they're not wounding you. That's a really good defensive ability for elves, and it's the sort of thing that I expect for wood elves, where straight up just, here's a 2-up armor save, never going to happen. But I'm going to jump through some hoops, here's a targeted debuff. If I use it correctly, you're going to really struggle to kill me, and I think there's a lot of skill expression with this spell lore, so I'm excited to see how people use it. And honestly, I'm going to lose to it a couple of times, and it's going to feel terrible, because they're going to absolutely outplay me until I learn how to deal with it, I'm sure. So, we've been talking about Dirthu's Wrath, great spell, but sometimes your opponent's not going to have a bad initiative stat. How are we going to overcome that? Well, there's a couple of ways, and if you've got an Elementalism caster, which I think is not a bad choice for Wood Elves in general, Elementalism obviously comes with Plague of Rust, which is really nice for making it so that those Hagbane tip shooting attacks actually do some damage to anything that isn't really lightly armoured. You've also got TMP, the Travel Mystical Pathways. You're playing an army that probably wants to not get caught, so being able to teleport a unit that's right in the charge arc of a dragon but doesn't have the movement to get out, that's a really solid play as well. Lots of stuff here, but also finally we've got the Stormcall signature spell. This is a spell that you weren't playing realistically ever up until this book's come out, and now there's maybe reasons to do so. So, Stormcall. It's a hex that casts on a 7+. It's, again, only a 12-inch range. This one, unfortunately, can't be cast into combat, which is a downside compared to the last hex we looked at. But until your next start of turn subphase, the target enemy unit suffers a -1 modifier to movement and initiative. Initiative is the importance part here, to a minimum of 1. If cast, it removes other hexes. So again, you can't double this up with the signature spell, Sapping Blight here that we were talking about previously for the Lore of the Wilds. So, Stormcall, -1 to initiative. That's really nice. Are there any other ways to combat that in? Yes, there are. There are the Forest Spites, and there is a 30-point upgrade. Unfortunately, this is the best one in the book. You can't duplicate them. You probably want to put this... So, Befuddlement of Spites is very good because it gives your opponent a single enemy unit in base contact with the model, -1 to weapon skill and initiative. That's really good on a combat character. It's also really good if you're trying to stack initiative negative modifiers, which are really hard to come by. This is one of the 2 sources that you can get as Wood Elves. I don't think I've missed any. But this is just a flat -1 initiative to any single unit that you're in base-to-base contact with. And if we look at Dirthu's Wrath, you're only casting that on a single model. It's the fighting rank of a single unit that the caster is engaged with. So you can theoretically debuff a unit not only to -1 here to a minimum of 1, but you can hit them with the Befuddlement of Mischief, which is -1 to both weapon skill and initiative with no minimum. So if you're playing against someone who has initiative 2 or initiative 1, Befuddlement of Mischiefs can get them down to initiative 0. What happens then? Here we have a little paragraph called Characteristics of 0. If a model has a characteristic of 0, it has no ability whatsoever in what the characteristic represents. Yada yada. If it's got weapon skill of 0, it always is auto-hit. If it has strength toughness of wounds of 0, it's slain and immediately removed from play. And then characteristic tests. If you have a characteristic test of 0, as you see here, additionally if it has a characteristic of 0 or dash, it automatically fails the test. So, Dirthu's Wrath. If your opponent is playing dwarves or undead, immediately you can get them to the point where you're auto-hitting them with this spell. And suddenly, D3 strength 4 hits per model in the fighting rank with no warden regen save, pretty decent. And worst case scenario, you go into elves who have default 4, you can get them down to 2, and they still fail 2/3 of the test that they have to take. So you can see that we've got actually a pretty interesting and exciting combination here that really hinges off the Befuddlement of Mischief. So sorry, you're going to have to take that off the Stag Lord. Let's put it on one of the Spell Singers. So this is the build that I've sort of settled on as where I'm going to start testing with this unit. You can do things differently. You don't have to go with Aspect of the Bear. If you're playing the Taliesin detachment, you don't need the Heartwood Pendant. You could drop on the Power Scrolls. You could make sure you've got some sort of more defense in there as well. You could look at some sort of ward save. As Sisters of the Thorn have been FAQ'd, they now obviously don't get to pick their spell, they have to roll, and they also do not bestow the 4-up ward save to any characters joining them, which was a little bit unclear beforehand, but now it's very clear that they definitely don't. So if you want a ward save on this model, you do need to give it some ward save, Talisman of Protection, something like that. However, so we've got the Aspect of the Bear and the Unicorn. That combos to give you a T4 model with 4 wounds, which is probably enough just to not survive. Keep in mind that this is a very, very mobile unit that's going to be, you know, realistically picking its fights. You shouldn't be slamming it into something that's going to be causing issues. Have it so it's not the model on the outside of the unit. Pick your charges, make sure you're positioning in a place where you're not going to be face-to-face with the Chaos Lord that's in the unit of Chaos Knights. You know, there's a lot of stuff you can do to make sure that you're not going to find issues when you charge in, so you probably don't need to go for the ward save. Level 4 Wild Magic, we're going to go Lore Familiar because I think it's really important to pick your spells with this caster. I've gone 2 Power Scrolls and a Heartwood Pendant, but you know, pick and choose your magic items as you like, and then a Befuddlement of Mischiefs as well. This is the combo we've talked about, so you're going to be hitting them with the -1 to initiative. -1 to weapon skill's nice as well for incoming attacks, but that's not the main thing. And then the Sister of the Thorn Bodyguard are going to take Stormcall as the signature spell. So you're going to roll in the Elementalism tree and just default swap to Stormcall. I think almost every game. Maybe if you are against someone with high initiative but also good armor saves, you might find that if you roll Plague of Rust, you just decide to keep it. I think most times you're just going to go straight to Stormcall and use that as the default swap there to make sure you're getting them down to a good initiative that you can, you know, slam your Dirthu into. So what does this unit achieve? Well, it's a fast bodyguard that's relatively tough, as Wood Elves go, because all of the models in the unit, aside from the wizard itself, have a 4-up ward save, which is really nice. So immediately you're nice and tanky. You can cast the regen on them from wild magic that you're getting in there as well, which is really solid. So this is a unit that isn't going to fall over to just range damage immediately, which is really nice. You're also really fast. The unit is able to march and still shoot if you want to, or you can cast reserve move on your unit and still, you know, just move 9, shoot. Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's 9. Move up, shoot, do your magic missile, and then move again with your reserve move, so a lot of flexibility there. And it lets you get into position so that instead of just going for that straight frontal charge, that a lot of the time is going to be potentially a lot of damage, but a lot of attacks coming back at you, depending what you're attacking, it gives you the flexibility to try and get around the flanks while you threaten with other bits and pieces. So I think this is a really solid unit that you can play around with. How are we equipping the Sister of the Thorn? Well, you need a unit champion, you need a standard bearer. That gives you the +2 to cast on your bound spell coming from their Daughter of the Covenant, I believe it's called. And then you're also probably going to want to take a Musician. Musician's just really good, especially on fast units that might be running away. Giving you +1 to march when you're next to an enemy unit is great. You know, the + to rally as well is fantastic. All of these things are really nice, and it's super cheap to have. You can also take magic banners, and I actually quite like the Banner of the Hunter King, which is a cheap banner, 25 points, and it gives you the ability to Vanguard. Vanguard on a wizard is incredibly powerful in my opinion, because if you put this unit down late in the day, you know, we put it down as one of your last units, You then get to make a normal move with it before we see who goes first. If your opponent is playing a caster it's really important for them to get their spells off before they move, so for example, they're in a unit that wants to travel mystical pathways, they're in a unit that wants to cast a lot of enchantment spells on turn 1, if you can get into dispel range, I think that's a really powerful way to mess with your opponent's plans without really causing you any issues. Obviously, if your opponent's got loads of shooting, just moving forwards towards the guns is probably not the safest thing you can do. But I think this is a unit that is very flexible. And I think when you're playing elves, you can't look at units in the sort of way that Warriors of Chaos do, which is just, here's my statistically better unit than yours, I'm going to move it forwards, it's going to hit you in the face, job's a good one. With elves, I think you have to be looking for the, how do I outplay? How do I get out of the charge arc? How do I make my opponent have to pick whichever of the 2 bad choices I've given them? And I think the Vanguard banner really helps with that, getting into dispel range of your opponent. It also, in other matchups, means that you can just potentially not have to mess around with that. You can go, oh, hold on, you've got a wizard that you've put near me, well, let me reserve move so that I'm turn 1 able to cast my enchantment spells without being in your dispel range if you go first. Like if we're playing against Warriors of Chaos, for example, they've got the puppet, they go, they're on the line, you're on the line, let's just make sure that we're out of range so that there's no issues casting your spells with that 3d6 pick the 2 lowest. So this is the good build that I wanted to talk about. There is another one that I'm going to talk about in a second, which I think is really interesting, which is basically a very similar sort of build. You're going, obviously, the aspect where you're... the Alter Kindred, I should say, where you become a forest spirit and you are able to join into Treekin, and you can do the same thing, and you can still do, the combo that you're looking for, where you're going to try and lower their initiative and hit them with Dirthu's Wrath. But you've also got a load of Tree Whacks in the unit. Now, Tree Whack is an interesting spell. In fact, let me pull that one up for you. I say spell, obviously I mean special rule. Tree Whack is a rule that you've got on the bigger forest spirits, and that is Treekin, Treemen, Treemen Ancients. Once per turn in the combat phase, each model with this special rule can replace one of its attacks to make a single Tree Whack attack. To make a Tree Whack, nominate a single enemy model within the enemy unit that it is engaged with to be the target of the attack. So you're picking specific models, you can kill unit champions, or you can try and snipe out characters very easily. The model must immediately take an initiative test. If failed, you suffer D3 hits at the strength of this model, with no armor save permitted, and if the test is passed, the target manages to avoid the Tree Whack. So this is very similar to Dirthu's Wrath, which is, I think, interesting because you can just double up, basically. So if you have 3 Treekin in the front rank, you're theoretically getting an additional 3 Tree Whacks on top of all of the initiative tests they have to take there. And if you're comboing it with, in this case, probably just -1 to initiative, you haven't got a good source of elementalism. Unfortunately, Treekin can't get a bound spell the way that Sisters of the Thorn can. But, potentially if you're lowering their initiative by 1, maybe that just changes the math enough on whether it's worth going for the Tree Whack instead of just going for a regular attack. And it is at the strength of the model, which means that for the regular Forest Spirits, the Treekin, we are looking at strength 4, which is fine. So you've got to pick your fights here, and it is a little bit harder to pick your fights with the Treekin. But if you're going for the reserve move, you're able to, move twice. There's maybe something in here. I think this is definitely in the realm of fun, but maybe not good, but I'm definitely going to play around with it because I really want Forest Spirits to be good. So how does this affect the list building overall? What are we looking like in terms of our allocation of heroes? I'm interested to play around with maybe an Elementalism tree man, or if I'm going for the Taliesin detachment, I'm actually probably going to try and play one of the Law of the Wilds tree men, which I think is a really interesting combination. The tree men, unfortunately, do suffer from lacking the output that they need, the Treemen Ancients specifically. So being able to not only hit them with a Tree Whack, but also hit them with the Dirthu's Wrath, I think is really interesting as well. Is it good? Probably not. What are we looking like on the rest of the characters? I'm really struggling to decide. I want to run 2 casters, I want to run 2 lords, I also want to run 2 nobles as well, 2 hero level characters. I'm struggling to fit everything that I want into the list. I also want to play around with Orion. I think there's so much good stuff in here. Shout out to Ors, friend of the channel, who has come up with an absolutely nasty build where you are completely uncontrollable, apart from screening, but you do play around with Monster Slayer and the new Kindred that gives you the ability, the Wild Rider gives you Furious Charge, gives you Frenzy. Yes, you're an absolute missile. You go with the dragon slaying sword. This is your anti-dragon tech. You're always going to be able to see them because you're a large target. You can screen with a unit of skirmishers in front so that they can get out the way. There's a lot of stuff in there that I think is interesting that I didn't catch initially, and it's going to be really hard to play around with character builds because I want to put stags in the list. I want to put everything in the list, but I think there's a real world where you can very comfortably go double wizard. I really like the Lore of the Wilds going for a combat style wizard build, which I think if you're going double wizard you probably want, because you're taking away from your ability to run multiple lords who are going to get in there and do some damage. So this is your damage threat, but instead of going for single targets you're going to try and mess up infantry units, which I think is interesting. And then you go for a second caster, which is probably the battle magic caster with the Ruby Ring of Ruin, bunkered in a unit of Glade Riders. They've got built-in reserve move. They're going to be moving and shooting and just being an annoyance. And if you can sort of pull and pick at your opponent from multiple different angles, I think that's probably going to be the strong way to play Wood Elves. With all that said, that leaves us without an elementalism caster. So maybe you go 2 wizards and a tree man with elementalism, and you just pray that you roll into, Plague of Rust. That might not be good. That might not be something that's worth playing around with. But yeah, lots of combinations. I think all of the characters that you can play in Wood Elves are really exciting, and it's the interesting thing to build around. But also, I'm not super bothered about taking a dragon, so you can fit more characters in, which is really nice. I think there's a lot of fun building to do there, and I'm excited to see the builds that you guys pull off as well. Thank you for watching. Thank you for getting to the end of the video. If you've reached this point and you haven't already, I would really appreciate a like, a comment, a subscription if you haven't done those things. It just helps me get seen by more people, boost me up in the algorithm, all of the stuff that the YouTubers do like to say. If you would like to support me in my goal to become a full-time YouTuber, I would absolutely appreciate that. You can become a member below. There are various perks to those, name at the end of the videos, all that good stuff, but it also unlocks some VIP areas in Discord if you become a Longbeard or Ground Knight tier supporter. Those VIP sections are the only parts that are locked away in Discord. You don't have to be a member to join the Discord. I'd recommend that you should. We've got about 450, 500 people on there. It's a great place for discussion, a lot of fun. I do try and chime in as much as possible. And it's also where the Fix My List show lists are put, and also if you are one of the Ground Knight or Longbeard tier supporters, where you participate in choosing which list I play in the monthly Pick My List series.